Well, hello everyone. Here we are for a fairly short lecture today on King James the First. King James the First is going to be a one part of a two-part series. The next lecture next week is going to focus on King James the Son, Charles the First, who I think is really living at a more interesting time for England. And without, of course, talking about King James the First, we can't quite get to Charles the First and everything that happens as a result. So King James the First, 1603 to 1625, he is actually Scottish, and he's from the Scottish line of the noble family. Let me move this bar out of the way here, maybe over there. Weird that that records too. And so we have Henry VII, and of course your famous Henry VIII right here, and all the kids of Henry VIII are right here, the ones that actually ruled at some point. Mary the First, Elizabeth the First, Edward the Sixth, right? And then there was this other line of family members that are over here under the Stuart name. So these are the Tudors, and these are the Stuarts by marriage related to Henry VIII and Henry VII. And so the deal is that after Elizabeth the First dies of old age, she makes it a long ways. What happens is that the next person to go to is actually going to be way down here. James the First is still alive, and James the First is going to become the King of England while he's still quite young, which is not all that uncommon in these stories of the next king showing up. It probably would have been Mary, Queen of Scotland, except that she tried to overthrow Queen Elizabeth, so Queen Elizabeth at some point had her executed. There we go. I added those animations. Very exciting, right? So James the First is actually going to be there when his mom is executed. He doesn't put up a protest because I think he knew that he was in line to be the next king after Elizabeth dies, and I think that was important to him. And so Elizabeth dies of old age. King James becomes the next guy to rule England as a Stuart as opposed to a Tudor, and that brings on all of this stuff here that we'll be getting into more of next week. Okay. So what about King James I, and why are we spending time on him? Well, the deal with him is that he is a Scottish raised fellow, and he's now in England ruling it, right? And England and Scotland have had interesting relations for a long time, especially seeing as England has been trying to conquer and subjugate Scotland for a long time, which it has largely done at this point, although there are rebellions coming in the next century. Regardless of that, James I comes from a realm of the island that is known as the United Kingdom now, where he's acquainted with Catholicism, but he is not a fan of Catholics. And King James I, although he was born to a Catholic family, he's not going to show up in England as a king and suddenly turn England back into a Catholic nation. That's something that some of his supporters in England were really hoping for. Catholic supporters were hoping that James would show up and become the king in 1603, and that he would somehow bring Catholicism back into England, or at least grant a lot more rights to Catholics than what the Catholics had under Queen Elizabeth and under Henry VIII. And so they're going to be really disappointed by this, and we'll talk more about that aspect in a second. Regardless of that, King James I is good at money making. He's going to authorize this company called the Virginia Company. You might remember last week we talked about Roanoke and the colony of Queen Elizabeth, where she was working with a number of supporters to set up a colony to help basically revive a fairly dead economy in England, thanks to the constant state of warfare England was in with Spain. And so England's way of making some money was to maybe start a colony and trade with that colony. And in the end, it did not work because Roanoke basically disappeared, and there's still that mystery as to what's truly happened to it, which you've already looked at. Regardless of that, James I likes the idea of setting up a colony, and so James I is going to authorize a company of private investors called the Virginia Company, named after Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, and they're going to found the Jamestown colony, which is, of course, where Virginia is today in the Chesapeake River. And so this is going to become, it's going to have a hard start, the Jamestown colony, but it's going to become extremely successful extremely quickly, and we'll talk about why in a second. And of course, King James is known for writing the King James Bible, which is not a Catholic interpreted Bible, by the way. It is more of a Protestant interpreted Bible. King James I is going to absolutely support the Anglican Church, the Church of England, even though he was born to a Catholic family. I think he just decided he needed to do that, being the King of England. So what's going to happen, one of the most famous things to happen in the reign of King James I was that there were a number of supporters, 13 of them, in fact, of the Catholics in England who were basically what you might call extremists. And when King James I was proven to not be pro-Catholic, or at least Catholic revival in England, being a good Anglican king, these 13 people, led by a fellow named Guy Fawkes, are going to try to blow up Parliament while King James I is in Parliament talking to the members of Parliament. And so it's called the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, and you'll see a video on that in just a moment. I wanted to look through here. Why is there a gunpowder plot on the 6th of, or the 5th of November? It's because you have a number of people here that are angry that King James I was not bringing Catholicism back to England. So we're going to have a break right here, and you're going to see a short video put out by the BBC that I think is pretty funny.
Come on, folks. You couldn't have done this alone.
Who was in your gang? I'll never tell you.
Oh, we'll see about that. What?
What?
No, you don't laugh, I laugh.
It was the plot that seemed unthinkable. Fawkes is the explosives expert.
So we're going to blow up King James and his entire family at the state opening of Parliament?
That's right. Any reason or just for fun?
John Wright is the persuader.
Because you're a Catholic and I'm a Catholic and the King hates Catholics. He seems to think we're always plotting something. As if.
It was the plot that sounded impossible. Robert Catesby is the brains.
So we're just supposed to roll 36 barrels of gunpowder down the Thames, sneak it into this rented cellar, wait for Parliament to open, then I creep back in, light the fuse, run away and blow up the king, and all without getting caught?
Yes.
Okay, just checking I had that down right.
It was the plot that would surely go wrong.
So I persuaded 12 guys altogether. That ought to do it, don't you think? Do you think we need one more?
Couldn't hurt.
I'll get one more. Excuse me. Would you like to be in a plot to blow up Parliament?
Oh, yes, why not? But I'll just check my diary. When were you thinking?
November the 5th?
Yeah, I'm free. Fabulous.
Well, that's 13 then. Hang on, isn't 13 an unlucky number?
Oh, don't worry. I'm sure it'll go off without a hitch.
Francis Tresham is the idiot.
Hang on. My brother-in-law's due in Parliament on November the 5th. I'll just send him a quick letter telling him to take the day off. I'm sure he won't tell anyone.
It was the plot
3, 2, 1.
that went wrong.
Oh.
Horribly, horribly wrong. Fawkes' 13.
What letter? What idiot sent a letter?
Failing to explode on November 5th, 1605.
You're going to be hung, drawn and quartered.
Gutted.
You will be.
Okay, now we're back. Leading to the Civil War, there's going to be, when we get to next week, we're going to talk a lot about a civil war that happened in England under King Charles I, which was James's son. Well, what happened was that James I believed in absolute power. England had been moving away from this. Unlike the rest of Europe, England had been moving away from the idea that their king should have complete and utter power of the divine right style of theory that we talked about in class. The idea that some religious authority, a pope or a head bishop, puts the crown on the king's head and thereby transmutes the power of God onto the king, and therefore anything the king does is somehow perfect and ordained by God. And that divine right theory is going to be around for a long time and has already been around for a long time. But England has been unique in moving away from that and forcing their kings to share power with that body of nobles called Parliament. And you might remember that back in 1215, there was the first attempt at this with the Magna Carta and King John. Well, that's going to increase as we go, and we talked about that already a little bit before the COVID virus era. Well, anyway, here we are with King James I, coming out of Scotland, becomes the King of England as the first Stuart king. And guess what he wants to do? He wants to try to limit the power of Parliament and take more power upon himself. And so there's going to be a great division between him and the nobles of England throughout his entire reign. The one thing about James, though, that we can say, he was an excellent politician. He was very good at never quite going too far. He knew when to back down before there was going to be some kind of rebellion of nobles against him. So he always had a way of getting a little bit more power for himself without actually starting a civil war. Unfortunately, King James's son, Charles I, is going to not be nearly as good of a politician, and therefore there will be a civil war during that time. There's a couple things that I think is interesting. That colony that King James sets up, for the Virginia colony, is over 4,000 miles away from England, and sailing to and from that colony took nearly 2.5 months. So obviously the colonists that are going to start to thrive in the Virginia colony, mostly growing and selling tobacco, those colonies, or that colony, is going to not be able to wait around for orders to come from the king or for responses to come to letters that the king sends. And so what that means is that the Virginia colony is going to set up a House of Burgess, which is basically their version of a parliament, or even a very simple version of a Congress. So, you know, a bunch of landowners that get to vote on what they want to do within their colony. And then, of course, they expect to have to report that back to the king and all that later. But, you know, people need to have faster reactions to things than 2, 3, 4, 5 months. And so King James, interestingly, just to give you an idea of how much of a micromanager he was that he heard that 4,000 miles away, his very successful Virginia colony that's making England a bunch of money is, oh my gosh, having meetings where they decide what to do on local issues. Oh no, not that, right? And so King James is actually mad about that. But that's just King James. King James is going to put down a bunch of restrictive navigation acts. The navigation acts are all about telling the colonists what they can and cannot do. Specifically, what they are is the navigation acts tell the colonists that they can only produce raw materials and send those raw materials to England, as opposed to making their own finished products. The idea of the colonies is the triangle trade, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the idea of the colonies is that raw goods go from the colonies to England. The English tradespeople can actually turn American raw goods into finished luxury goods, and then send those goods back to the colonists for trade. That's called mercantilism, and it's a massive economic idea that's going to drive the British Empire as we move forward in the timeline. And so King James I wants to make sure that the colonists who are harvesting raw materials don't actually make anything with those raw materials. And so he passes the Navigation Acts, which say, colonists, you can only make raw materials and send them to England, and then you have to buy English goods only from England. You cannot buy any manufactured goods, for instance, from other countries. And so the problem is that there's no way to enforce this. 4,000 miles away, the English Navy is not nearly big enough to do this, to police the entire Atlantic Ocean. And so the reality is that the Navigation Acts are passed, and they're not very effective. And so the colonists start to get used to, at this point, creative management, which means that they're certainly going to smuggle goods to and from the rest of Europe if they're able to get away with it. And they're certainly going to manufacture some of their own products if it's too hard to get those products from England through trade. So anyway, that happens, the Navigation Acts. This is just an idea of what's happening between King James and the colony. And then finally, this is an interesting moment where King James steps a little bit too far. King James decides that he wants his newborn son, Charles I, to marry a Spanish princess and thereby do what Henry VII did for Henry VIII, his son, which was to try to marry into the Spanish Empire. That makes a lot of sense, but the only way this works, most people think, is if England goes back to being a Catholic nation again. And so there's a whole lot of Anglicans and Puritans, both of them non-Catholic religious people in England, who are very angry with the idea of Charles I, the prince, to be the next king, being married to a Spanish princess. And so there's a ton of tension that happens because of this. And over this tension, King James I actually stops Parliament from meeting. He dissolves it in anger and doing something like that is very much, as it says here, like the US president canceling Congress and saying Congress no longer exists. Obviously, this is not going to last very long. There's just some bad blood between the king and Parliament, because Parliament, which was Anglican and Puritan, could not believe that King James I would try to marry his son to a Catholic monarch. That just did not sit well with the English, who wanted to keep away from Catholic power ploys as much as possible. This is an interesting statement from King James I that tells us a lot about how he thought. I'll read it. Kings are justly called gods, for that they exercise a manner of resemblance of divine power upon earth. They make and unmake their subjects. They have power of raising and casting down, of life and death, judges over all their subjects, and in all causes not yet accountable to none, but only God. And so you have this statement where it's obvious that King James I sees himself as being an ultimate ruler, and nobody else should be able to rule with him. So this isn't going to go well for him to keep doing this. There's going to be a lot of anger amongst the people of England who have gotten used to sharing power with the king. So this is something that King James will back down on a little bit. He won't really push this idea too far. Parliament will start meeting again, and finally King James will die, and Charles I will take over, and we'll talk about that part next week. A bit more about the Virginia colony, since this is going to be a big deal for England. King James allows it to be founded, meaning he permits the Virginia colony to be founded in 1607. It's going to become very profitable by 1614, selling mostly tobacco, but also cotton and other products back to England. This, to be clear, the reason why this matters, guys, is because normally England would get this stuff from Europe. But England cannot get this stuff from Europe because England is at war with Europe, because England is Protestant, while Europe is basically governed by the overwhelming power of the Spanish Empire, which is Catholic and has declared England as being heretical for not being Catholic itself. And so England needs a colony if it's going to get this kind of material for its economy and for its people. So that's where the Virginia colony becomes extremely successful. It is able to provide these things by 1614, which means a whole bunch of other people are going to move to America to set up colonies very soon, because there's lots of money to be made in the colonies and lots of money to be made back in England by just having a trade between England and the colonies. I'll show you a map of this in just a moment. I want to mention this. King James gets a little bit jealous of the power that the Virginia Company has, especially because the Virginia Company is making a lot of money on this colony in Jamestown. And so King James is going to dissolve the Virginia Company and take over direct management for a while. So that happens in 1624 when King James goes, oh, heck, this is working. I'm going to take over as the guy that's going to directly govern Virginia. And so this is going to happen pretty quickly. Notice this, between 1607 and 1776, these are all the 13 colonies that build up. It starts with this little town of Jamestown and expands into nearly 3 million English people living here, developing a raw goods economy right here in this whole area of the eastern seaboard over the course of just under 100 years. So that's a pretty amazing, or just over 100 years. That's a pretty amazing expansion of a colonial empire. And it's not just like the Spanish going into South America to basically mine gold and silver. This is people showing up to live permanently, and they're setting up actual economies. They're setting up farms and fisheries and whale hunting sites and lumber yards and shipbuilding projects and everything. It's just, this is a major new territory being created by England for the purpose of creating raw goods for the English to use. A little bit about the Puritans that become more powerful in James I's time. The Puritans are interesting because they start out as being very, well, they're Anglican English that basically want to fix the Anglican Church. The Puritans are fixers. They are people who think that they need to reform the Church of England. They believe the Church of England is not serious enough about its duties as being the Church of England. And so the Puritans want to purify. That's what the name is about. Want to purify the Church of England by making it better in the way that they want it to be. Now, this is an interesting idea because this is far more extreme the way the Puritans want the Church of England to be than what the Church of England already is. And so there's a lot of pushback from it. A lot of Anglicans do not want to be Puritans because that's asking them to be far too serious about this. And the Puritans are also very active, though, is the problem, because the Puritans are not really all that poor. They happen to be among the coastline of England where all the seaports are. And it's very often that the Puritans are the ever-growing, wealthier middle class of England. They are the people that are building ships and shipping cargoes around full of tobacco and cotton from the New World to England, and they're shipping English products back to the New World. These Puritans have money, and they have power because they have money. And they may not be nobles, but they're able to influence a lot of what England does. And so there is going to be a civil war that happens largely between the Puritans and the Anglicans, and who supports the king versus who supports the change of the Puritanism. Again, that'll be next week. Something about this, though, is that some of the Puritans, the one reason I bring this up, some of the Puritans saw what was happening in the Virginia colony down here and realized that they could move out of England. If they didn't like England's religion, the Puritans, some of them can become separatists, and they can leave England and go to America and set up their own colony and worship Puritanism however they want. And so a bunch of them will do this. 100 of them will do this in 1621, and then tens of thousands more of Puritans will come from England over to America to set up permanent colonies and be Puritan colonists. And so this is where they go for the most part, is New England. That's Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut. Okay, and that's if I go back to the bigger map, these guys are right up here. This is where the Puritans go, right up here. Okay, and they're very profitable. They have their own economy that is going to be extremely well found in English trade. It includes wheat, fish, beef, pork, horses are bred there and sent to England, lumber, and even this molasses, sugar, rum, and indigo are what the New Englanders import. And then we have some specialties of what the New Englanders actually create, which is whale oil, because there were a lot of whale hunting trades in New England, and whale bone. Whale bone was used for a lot of products that we use plastics for today. So whale bone was extremely important back then. And finally, they build ships and transport cargoes. So the New Englanders were largely based on maritime trade for quite a long time. And this is the trade we're talking about, coming from the New World of England's colonies anyway, to England and back. And so coming from here, this is the mercantilist trade that the New World sets up, starting with Virginia and expanding. We've got products like fish, whale oil, lumber, tobacco, rum, iron products coming from America, from the American colonies, and they're going to England. And then the English turn these products into manufactured goods, and therefore they get paychecks. Now they're getting paid because they have jobs, and then they ship those products right back to the colonists for the colonists to buy. And so this is an economy called mercantilism, but it's known as the triangle trade because if you put it on a map, it's triangular in shape. And if you'll notice this right here, rum and iron products are also going to Africa, to the west coast of Africa from America, and the British are shipping tools and weapons down to the west coast of Africa as well. And in return, slaves are being bought from the English colonists or English native citizens, and these slaves are being shipped over to America. What are these slaves doing? They're providing the labor force that keeps this entire thing cheap, right? It's all about that. Whenever you have any form of capitalist system set up, which is what mercantilism is, that England creates here, whenever you have a form of trade set up based on products and consumerism, thereby capitalism, then if you have cheap labor, everything is always cheaper. And that's the linchpin, is cheap labor. So today, of course, a lot of our products are made in Southeast Asia. Why are they made in Southeast Asia? Because the labor is cheaper than it is here in the United States. And so that's a huge part of our economy, is having stuff made by the cheapest labor force. And it's always going to be like that as long as we have economies based on profit. So there you go with that. So 1625, Charles I takes over because King James dies, And Charles is going to be anti-parliament, just like his dad is, except that Charles, and Charles wants to be an absolute ruler, just like his dad wanted to be. But Charles is going to be a really bad politician. And so when we come back, we're going to be talking about how Charles angers the English people so much that his head gets cut off. Okay? So we're going to get to that when we return. I don't want to go too far here until we get to it. And so there's the scene of Charles's head getting cut off. And we'll come back to this next week. Thanks a lot.